Hello, everyone. This is JT Keating, the Vice President of Product Strategy for Zimperium. I'd like to welcome you to another webinar. This one we're very excited about as we start getting ready for the holiday shopping season and Black Friday here in North America and the like. We thought it made a lot of sense to spend some time looking at the top shopping apps around the world and get a feel for what kind of security or privacy risks might be in them. The usual perfunctory stuff, we're going to try and keep this to 20, 25 minutes, and then Q&A at the end. Please use the Q&A capability of Zoom here. If there aren't any questions at the end, we're not the company that makes questions up. We don't believe in that. We'll just give you some time back to go grab yourself a hamburger or depends on where you are in the world, maybe breakfast, and then you can kind of be off to the races. Very excited for this particular one, and we're going to dive into the various ways that we assess these apps for security and privacy risks. We did one recently that was on the top travel apps in the world. Before that, we did banking apps. So we can kind of draw some little parallels here and there. But one of the tests is from the OWASP side of things. And I'm very excited to be joined by Sean Wright from OWASP. He's going to help me provide a little commentary around that part of the analysis of shopping apps. And then Sean and I are actually going to do a full session on just the OWASP Mobile Top 10 in December. So Sean, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure and honor to be included in this webinar. I'm really looking forward to it. Some exciting results. So yeah, really looking forward to discussing the results and hopefully touching on what OWASP does a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely going to do that because even as we dive into the, as we dive into some of the results, I think that there's a possibility that there are some folks that are out there developing particularly mobile apps, considering where your guys' heritage came from, that might not even really be fully aware of your mobile top 10, hence the reason we're also doing the webinar in December. So starting to let people know about you guys and why the benchmarks matter, I think is really going to be key. So with that, let us dive in. So here's the report itself. And everyone that's attending the webinar will actually provide the written report too. This is obviously a summary webinar on it, but we will provide the report to everybody. What we did is we took the 30 of the top shopping apps. Really what we did is we took 60. We took the top 30 apps, but we did their iOS versions and their Android versions. And then we basically run them through an engine that we have called Z3A, which is Advanced App Analysis. And that engine actually is able to determine security, privacy risks, and through part of the conversation related to both, OWASP Top 10, for instance, as a consistent benchmark. And for security and privacy parts of it, gives each app a passing score, an average score, or a failing example. I'm going to explain what those are here in a quick second. We've made these results anonymous. Because it's basically kind of a responsible disclosure. We have this results. We know exactly which of these results map to each one of the actual apps. But until we have a chance to actually talk to each of the app providers and say, look, here's how you're exposing user data, for instance, or here's how you're insecurely configuring yourself, or here's how you're susceptible to reverse engineering. We want to talk to the app providers first. Otherwise, it would be irresponsible. If all of a sudden we said XYZ shopping app was exposed to this threat, we've just given a playbook to the bad guys. So that's the point. We're going to proactively reach out to all of the providers. But if you are a shopping app provider, please feel free to ping us. Matter of fact, jt.keating, Keating, at Zimperium. You can even just come to me directly if you are an app provider. We will give you the detailed results. These, we're giving you the summary version. Z3A actually produces reports that are sometimes 70 pages long of findings. So that's actually what we're going to give to the actual providers themselves to be able to fix some of the issues we're about to talk about. I mentioned for the security and privacy parts, there's a passing, average, and failing. Basically what it means is passing says it really has very few risks and is way above the curve in terms of protecting user data. From a numerical standpoint, when we start getting into some of these things, it has a low score of 35 and below is the mathematical computation. The opposite extreme is easier to explain, is straight up failing. These are ones that basically are saying there's huge risks in this app that really need to be fixed. We're going to talk about the classifications of those risks. Basically, it's I think around a 65 and above is a failing grade when we actually start getting into this. And then average is in the middle. They have some issues that need to be fixed, but it's not in either one of the polls. So I mentioned we have 3 report categories we're getting into, and this presentation is going to run through each of these categories as we start going forward. The first one is the one that Sean and I are going to be talking about, which is the OWASP top 10 summary. When we get to that section, I'm going to have Sean dive in a little bit more on exactly what it is, but it basically is best practices for mobile app development from a security and privacy standpoint. Then we're going to go into the Z3A specific analysis of what are the main privacy risks for iOS apps and for Android apps. And what you're going to see is they're different. And what I think is kind of interesting is it's very consistent at the highest level. The issues are different, but the highest level of which is more susceptible to privacy risks or which is more susceptible to security risks, the shopping apps are very consistent with the travel apps we just did. The issues are a little bit different below, but the overarching point that I'm going to make here in a minute, I'm going to not get ahead of ourselves because I don't want to steal all my own thunder, it's very consistent. So the privacy risks are ones where you can actually, you're exposing user data, you're exposing information about the device. Maybe you're accessing, backward-facing cameras without user permissions, things that impact privacy. Security, of course, are things that really have to do with the code use, potential reverse engineering, vulnerabilities where you could potentially have your app being used in some way, shape, or form to cause problems. Now, the key is the security and the privacy risks are not incongruous with the OWASP. They're actually very consistent, as we'll show, and as we start running through these things. So with that, we're going to dive into the OWASP. But Sean, before we actually talk about the OWASP, the mobile top 10 specifically, for those folks that aren't familiar, can you kind of bring them up to speed a little bit on who OWASP is, how long you guys been around, and kind of what your mission is?
Absolutely. So OWASP is actually an acronym for Open Web Application Security Project. It initially started off focused on web applications. It's since then it's grown into covering different areas such as mobile apps, even APIs. And this kind of, with the rise of web applications becoming more complex, you have things like APIs associated with web applications. Sometimes a mobile web app is just really, in essence, a browser wrapped around the web app. So OWASP has been going since 2001. As I said, initially focused on web apps. The top 10, OWASP, it's still one of the big projects of OWASP. That covers the top 10 most common vulnerabilities. And since then, it's branched off into different avenues. So you'll see the OWASP mobile top 10. There's a API top 10 or a draft of that out. And also with OWASP, there's different local chapters. So if you're interested, really recommend have a look at the OWASP website. You can find a local chapter that you can hopefully within traveling distance, and you can take yourself and go to the local events. Everything is free. One of the big things about OWASP is it's non-profit, so all the projects and all of that do not charge anything. It's all free.
That's awesome. And it in this world, there's so much going on that having open communication and having direct, ability to talk to peers and stuff is huge. And I do think having benchmarks, some kind of consistent benchmarks, is a critical part of this whole thing too. So we're not going to go into every part of the OWASP top 10 today, the mobile top 10, specifically to Sean's point about the various different ones, the web, the API, the mobile. Obviously, we're focused on mobile right here. In Z3A actually understands the mobile top 10 and provides information back on each app in terms of, do they pass the OWASP top 10 or do they not? Each one. So when the OWASP categories here, it's either pass or fail. There isn't that middle category we've got for security and privacy when we come over there. When Sean and I get back together on December 11th, I really recommend for anybody who's doing mobile app development, join us for that webinar. That's when we're literally going to go, okay, M1, we're talking about improper platform usage. What exactly does that mean? And just kind of run through them in detail. But you can see there's storage, there's communications, authentication, cryptography, code quality, reverse engineering. What we're going to do now is step into, what did we learn from the iOS side? What did we learn from the Android side? And oh, by the way, what happens when you look at all 60 of them together? And on that particular point, here's the summary when you take all 60 together. For different reasons, 100% of them are vulnerable to reverse engineering. And that would enable, amongst other things, attackers to be able to create imposter apps. 92% of them are not properly securing the data or the communication, sorry. There's something wrong with the communication. They're opening some things up. It could be the mistreatment of certificates. It could be the lack of certificates. It could be whether or not they're not even validating whether certificates are legit. But a huge percentage of them, there's issues in the communication component, which for a shopping app is an issue. 70% don't properly secure the storage. Quite often, which we'll talk about here in a minute, what that means is other apps on the device can get access to some of the data that's being stored, depending, for instance, on the cloud provider. And then 48% are vulnerable to code tampering. So these are basically, what we did from the summary standpoint is we said, what do the majority of the apps have issues with? Now, I've got some personal theories, but Sean, before I kind of dive into something about this, what jumps out at you with this? What sort of either thoughts or questions, and is there anything surprising to you?
So one of the concerns that I had when I first saw these figures is if you consider what these apps are, they're online shopping, right? And by the very nature, they're going to have some sort of financial data flowing through it, and probably personal data, such as personal name and delivery address or home address, even billing address. So seeing quite a number of apps affected is quite worrying. I was expecting that to be quite lower. But then also when you start delving into some of these things, so one of the things is the secure communication. I've seen so many applications and systems that don't do things like appropriate certificate validation. And one of the areas around that is people just, for whatever reason, don't understand the risks that actually means. So I think you might look at these numbers and go, oh my gosh, that's bad. But perhaps the bigger thing to look at is, are those developing these apps have the education, the awareness that they need to be able to prevent or fix these types of things?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And to me, part of the reason that Sean and I said, hey, let's do the December session is when I see huge numbers like this, these teams, I mean, we're talking the top shopping apps in the world, right? So these teams are really good. And so if that many of them are having issues, you wonder if that many of them understand some of the benchmarks and some of the tools that might be available, and in what ways might they be being exposed. And the reality is most of these guys, I mean, they really are well-intentioned. They really are, but they're also competing, and they're trying to compete on new features and speed and all these different things. And security quite often does take a little bit of a backseat. But giving them a consistent benchmark, I think the other thing that's cool about this, what I'm excited about, is when Sean and I do this session again next year, he doesn't know that, but he's going to. When we do that next year, after we've talked to all these guys, I can't wait to see how far down these numbers go, because they will have a consistent thing that they can compare against, and they can actually start fixing some stuff up. So as we dive in, here's the iOS version, okay? This is really interesting. You can see that there are 3 tests for iOS that, and almost 4 that basically 100% of the apps failed. Reverse engineering is going to be a consistent one, as we said. We'll see that one again without question on the Android side as well. But insecure storage and insecure communications. Now, what I think is interesting, giving a little bit away, when we get to the privacy side of things, we're going to show that the iOS apps as a group are significantly riskier from a privacy standpoint than the Android ones. When you look at some of the stuff here, Sean, like insecure data communications, insecure storage, those, when we shift over to the Android one, those drop. They're still there, but they drop. I got to believe that's completely consistent with some of these privacy risks we're going to be talking about. What are your thoughts?
So it's really interesting, because if you take a step back and look at the perceptions of Android and iOS, or even Google and Apple, you can see Apple's pushing really hard, especially on iOS, to be a privacy-focused ecosystem. And Android's kind of perceived to be very open. Google themselves, whatever your perceptions are, I think the general perception is they're not very privacy focused. So these results kind of contradict that. Also, iOS, you would expect them to vet these apps a bit more if they're going to be focused on the privacy side, especially, as I said, they're focusing on privacy. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, because, as I said, this kind of comes as a surprise to me.
You know what, Sean, that's a great point. And to me, there's a couple of thoughts that come up with it. One is, a long time ago, I mean, I was around during this. You probably weren't. You're younger than me. When they first were saying, we're going to mandate seatbelts, right? Well, people were like, yeah, but if you make people wear seatbelts, then they're going to drive more dangerously, right? It's like this kind of weird logic, kind of thing. There is something to say, well, look, Apple's already taken care of all this privacy stuff. I guess I don't have to worry about it quite as much. That's like one perspective. Then there's the other thing, which is when Apple's vetting the apps, they don't have an automated ability to look at these same things today, not to the best of my knowledge. So I think when they're vetting apps from a privacy standpoint, it's probably in and around EULAs, in and around what you're saying you're going to do, and what you're saying you're going to do with the data, as opposed to programmatically what's a part of it. I don't know that as a fact, but that's kind of a gut. If we move over to the Android side, you can see that storage and communications are still issues, but they drop. There's a little bit more that comes up in authentication. Cryptography is still there. Again, just some risks. Reverse engineering is still alive and well. Any thoughts on this one, Sean? Just from a snapshot, maybe even compared to the iOS side?
Yeah. So the communications, I can certainly speak from some sort of experience. So Android before, this is primarily around certificate validation. With earlier versions of Android, I think it's before 6 and below, certificate validation was very much on the developer of the app. That's kind of completely flipped. You now have to really go out of your way to kind of disable certificate validation. I've faced the pain because when I'm trying to investigate an app, you have to do a lot of work to try get it to work through something like a proxy so you can intercept the traffic. So Android in that aspect has done a lot. So maybe that's speaking why there's better security around communications. iOS, I think it's still much to some point of view on the app developer. I don't think it's as nailed down as the Android ecosystem. I could be wrong. I'm not an iOS developer, but that's just what I've dealt with and my thoughts on it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. When we put all 60 apps together, we come back over here. One of the ones that kind of pops out at me is in relative to when we did the travel apps. It's about 50-50 on the code tampering. We've talked about some of the other things, the reverse engineering and stuff. But as we noticed, the iOS apps were much more susceptible to code tampering than the Android ones here. That was not necessarily the case with the travel apps. So this is just an interesting perspective when you kind of look across both. Now, as we pivot and move over to the privacy side, like I said, OWASP, those categories kind of match into exactly the overall topic of privacy and security. Now, in case you're wondering, there's malicious apps. And here at Zimperium, we detect that with a machine learning engine called Z9. Back to the Android thing, last week, we were part of the team, and I just did a webinar yesterday on this, where Google announced that they're actually going to put every one of the apps that's going into the Google Play Store through our engine. And there's a couple others as well to continue to improve that ecosystem. And that's huge. A key point that I made over there is the vast majority of the malware is not from Google. Google actually does a great job. It's actually from third-party app stores. To Sean's point about it being a very open ecosystem, people go to third-party app stores all the time. That's where almost all the malware comes from. So as we're talking about security and privacy risks, I just want to make a point. We're talking about very legitimate apps, right? In this case, legitimate shopping apps from major players around the world. They just have security and privacy risks. Malware is a totally separate conversation. So if you're a company, for instance, and you've got employees with their devices accessing your data, you definitely need to know about the malware, but you also need to know about apps in your ecosystem that have security and privacy risks. If you don't have both views, then you've got some issues. So what are some of the privacy risks, or what is the view when it comes to iOS and Android? I mentioned passing score, average, failing. Passing means you've got below average risk. You've actually done a very good job of taking care of business. As we mentioned, and I'm going to show you the chart here with anonymized names, 100% of the iOS apps failed to receive a passing grade. Android wasn't that much better. There's only 2 that actually received a passing grade. So when we look at it from the snapshot, what was the average? And again, remember, like 65 and above is considered risky, 35 and below is considered passing, right? 65 and above, failing, to use the terminology. So as a group, iOS failed. The highest risk was almost a perfect storm. And I'm going to talk about what made it so risky here in a minute. Almost a perfect storm of every kind of issue you might even have to potentially expose privacy risks. The lowest score was a 44. So even the lowest score was not passing on iOS, whereas I mentioned there are 2 that had passing grades on Android, and Android was pretty much down the middle. There were some, as we dive into it, some apps that actually failed, and we're going to talk about it. So for the iOS app, that one that was off the charts, what were some of the issues? And I'm not going to go through every single one of them, especially in interest of time. But interesting things. They're logging all the information to a system console. Why does that seem bad? Well, any app can access whatever data is put into the system console, which means every other app on the device can take that same information. The full UI or the iOS passport, they're actually taking screenshots of the UI. Why do you need to take a screenshot of the UI if you're a shopping app? That doesn't make any sense at all. And by the way, this is probably a good place to talk about this, and Sean, get your commentary on it. Again, we don't think that the majority of these things are consciously being done by the organization that's putting these apps out. Quite often when people are putting these mobile apps together, it's like Legos. The developer is under the gun. They need to have access to a camera, for instance. They go grab a library, an SDK, and off the web and throw it in without realizing that it might be doing some of these things. So there might be some things, like in this case, putting an advertising framework. Chances are, if you're putting an advertising framework into a shopping app, which you got to ask why you're doing that, because people are already buying stuff from you. So are you advertising for somebody else now? That's probably a corporate decision. They probably decided to do that. Doing things like, having the ability to send an SMS message or sharing the password with a keychain of other apps, probably not a corporate strategy. Taking screenshots of the full UI, again, for a shopping app, why would you even do that? Probably not a corporate strategy. These are some of the things that people need to know, and quite often happen and Sean and I were talking about this yesterday. The majority of all of our customers that are doing app development, one team is doing the iOS side and the other team is doing the Android side, which is quite often why we end up with very different results when we actually analyze these. When I look at the Android app, the highest scoring Android app, some consistent things, but also some different things. For instance, retrieving the device's last known GPS coordinates. Now, you might say with that one, well, I need to know if you're close to my brick and mortar. Well, just so happens that this app is not a brick and mortar app, and why do I need that when I can ask the customer? I think more frightening, it can programmatically access the back-facing camera, and what's not stated on this one quick little sentence is without the user permission, okay? So there are things along these lines. Using an insecure content provider, I already talked about the fact that means you can share the data with others. And so when we look at this, as I mentioned, here's the anonymous results. You're kind of like, okay, fascinating. The most important parts is how much red do you see and how much green do you see? And as you can see across this board, the iOS teams have some significant issues. Now, I'm going to run through another 2 slides and then stop and see if Sean's got any comments on this. When we actually are breaking these things down, there's all sorts of levels of granularity in terms of issues, right? There's some issues that are informational only. Hey, you might want to check this out. The top 2, or the bottom 2, depending on your perspective, are critical or dangerous. Critical issues are those that there's imminent data leakage problems, or you might actually get rejected by Apple or Google for even having it in there. Pinpoint location is only supposed to be used for navigation apps. If it's in a shopping app, you can actually have your app kicked out if Apple pays attention, for instance. Dangerous issues are ones like ad networks and things that can be exposed, but they're not like, you should really fix these now. On iOS, here's some examples of the critical privacy issues. I mentioned 100% are logging to System Console, which by itself, you might say, it's not a bad, but that means that it's accessible to any other app. 97% are doing exactly what we were talking about, screenshots of the full UI. I'm still trying to come up with a legitimate case for why a shopping app needs to screenshot my UI. I don't understand it. So why are 97% of these guys doing it? It's possible, again, just straight code reuse across the board, and they don't even potentially even know it. Same thing with the iOS pasteboard. When we come over to the Android side, 83% are using an insecure content provider. Similar to the system log data that I was talking about on the iOS side, other apps can start to request and access that data potentially, including malicious apps. And then 27% of these guys are using beacons, which by itself might not be a problem, but it can actually track users across apps and locations. So visually, this is what it looks like. So Sean, on the privacy side of things, I realize we're almost to the bottom of the hour, and I want to be respectful of people's time before we move over to security. Any comments on the privacy side?
Sure.
Any surprises?
I mean, as you mentioned, teams are under the gun to do releases. So I think some of those things might even be fallout from development. So for example, the full screenshot, you might find a development team needed to take a screenshot for, I don't know, some marketing brochure or some internal documentation or whatever. So they might have put screenshots and then just didn't remove it when it came to creating the production release. And I think that's also an important thing to call out is often you'd have the sequence moving from a test to production, and some of the fallout from the testing environment is not removed before it's rolled out to production. So
that's actually a great point. I didn't even think about that. Yeah, that's an excellent point.
It's often such a rush. So my advice is to companies, like, make sure when you're releasing an app that you check in your production environment, removing things like debug statements and debug flags and that kind of thing, because those can result in these privacy type issues. And then as well, look at the documentation of the iOS and Android. They often have very good details on what you should and shouldn't do. Because the other thing from a user perspective, and something I always advocate to users, if I'm installing an app and I see a permission that just doesn't make sense to me, it's immediately going to raise flags like, hey, should I trust this app? So even though it might have been a mistake, you can risk your app being flagged as something suspicious. So it's important to address these things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, one of the things that I could have talked about at the beginning is I saw something just yesterday evening was shared by a colleague of mine, who, by the way, is phenomenal. He runs all of our social media and communications. So make sure you follow us on Facebook or on LinkedIn and Twitter. Give my shout out to my boy. But he's the one who shared this, that last year, slightly over $2 billion was done over the holiday season with mobile apps, mobile shopping apps, and they expect it to be significantly higher even this year. So it's a real issue as we're facing. So moving over to the security side of things, here 83% of the iOS apps did not receive a passing grade, but almost 100% of Android ones failed to receive a passing security grade. And we're going to spend a little bit of time on this. So back to the chart again, 35 and below, passing, 65 and below or above, failing. You can see that almost 3/4 of the Android apps, the average was 74, right? So 3/4, sorry, that was a misstatement. I was just looking at the 74%. But the average was a 74. We look at the lowest scores, they're relatively consistent between the two of them. But the highest score was a 58 for security risks on iOS versus an 84 on Android. When we actually look at that Android app and said, what were the security issues that were in there? There's a bunch of them. And a lot of them have to do with JavaScript and the ability to do injection and things along those lines. The ability to execute commands at the OS level, which is supposed to be only for system level sort of things. The ability to download files from from the internet outside of the vetting process of any of the, let's say the Play Store, for instance. Similarly, ability to implement additional code, right? So this app had major issues. If we look at them, again, the key is look at the red and look at the green. And you can see that, there's like 4 or 5 that actually got a passing grade out of the entire 60. And you see a whole lot of red and a whole lot of big numbers on the security side on the Android apps. So what were some of the critical security issues on iOS? A lot of them, Sean mentioned earlier, around some of the processes around communications. The issue when we went back and looked at the OWASP and the insecure communication, the tests that they were failing, there are things like the ability to override validations, the ability to actually use unsecured connections to lower TLS versions, for instance. Then there's also the Swizzling API, which by itself is not necessarily inherently bad, but can be manipulated to do some different things. There was a famous case a few years ago about a bank in Europe where the attacker actually took advantage of the swizzling to be able to insert their transactions through the app to actually do fraud. And then you've got over-the-air installations, which obviously violates and goes completely around Apple's well-known review process. When we look at the critical issues on Android, there's a bunch. It's 2 pages. So again, I won't go into every detail about these. But as we mentioned, one of them, WebView can execute JavaScript, 83% of these apps, and that can allow an attacker to insert arbitrary Java code into the actions. 80% of them have functionality that will make it easy to spoof the package name of the app, obviously making it much easier to trick people into installing an imposter version of your apps. Again, you kind of run down through some of the ones I've already mentioned, but a lot of them just have the ability to insert. Now, before I go to the next slide, Sean, any surprises or any recommendations on some of the things that are on this particular list of security issues?
Yeah, so one of the things I want to call out, like certificate validation, because I see this in a couple of these, is vital if you're doing any sort of communication. Many people think of TLS or SSL, hopefully not using SSL anymore, but TLS as a means of protecting the data from someone viewing that data. Well, that's true. It's also there to prevent tampering with data. And to me, in some aspects, that's even more important. So, for example, in the iOS vulnerabilities, the over-the-air updates. If I'm able to get in between the connection between your mobile app and the server while it's doing over-the-air updates, I can then suddenly change what's actually installed on your app and do bad things. So it's vital that certificate validation is performed, and typically leave it up to the OS. As I mentioned, Android does a really good job of this these days. iOS it is still pretty decent, so there shouldn't really be a need for you to tamper with that. And the other thing to call out is the code execution. To me, this is kind of up there as the worst kind of security issue you can have, in my opinion, because just what you can achieve with code execution, that to me just alarms me. Any sort of vulnerability I see around code execution just has me freaking out.
Right.
Yeah, I put it up there as like, oh my gosh, we have to fix this now, drop everything, fix it right now kind of thing. And then, yeah, the other ones, yeah, they're still not great either.
Yeah, no, the code execution, like you said, I think is critical. And then here's, we're going down, obviously, but so there's some here that, again, in the interest of time, we won't spend a lot of time on, but here's again, you see the, do not check the validation of the CN, right? There's the compiled code, and external. So there's a whole bunch of, or the methods to blindly load app and jar files. There's all these things that go directly into what Sean was just talking about. And again, this is just a visual of it, and the report actually goes into more detail on each one of these. So in terms of what now, we're going to finish up and see if anybody has any questions. If you're a company and you want to know, do I have any kind of apps that are in my environment that have these kind of threats, we can talk to you about that. If you are an app provider, in the report, it actually has kind of the anonymized results like this that says, okay, and this happens to be shopping app number 1. How did you do on the OWASP top 10 for iOS? How did you do for Android? What was your security and privacy scores, et cetera? If you're an app provider, we're going to try and reach out to you, like I said, from responsible disclosure, and run you through the 70-page, quite often 60, 70-page technical report of your app that's behind these summaries. If you are an app provider and you just want to accelerate that process, like I mentioned, just shoot me an email, jt.keating@zimperium.com, and we will actually get on the phone with you, share your part of the report, share how you compare against the industry, obviously, from looking at the reports, and make some recommendations. So with that, we're going to stop and see if anybody has any questions. I apologize for us being a few minutes over. Sean, while we're waiting for questions, any other last thoughts or kind of advice that you would give folks? Well,
first I want to call out or give you guys a shout out. I think this kind of stuff is really helpful. At the end of the day, I know companies can get involved and throw things back and forth, but what I really like about you guys is you focus on just presenting the raw facts and that, and at the end of the day, this is just going to help the users. And to me, the users are the most important people at the end of the day. Obviously, the companies and that need help where they can. They're there to make profits in that, and I'm not judging them, but helping users is to me the important part. But also, the other thing I want to call out is there's a lot of resources online. OWASP has a fantastic array of projects, documentation, Even Twitter, go on Twitter. A lot of people, especially in the InfoSec community, are always willing to help out. Always passionate about helping other people out, trying to reduce the security risks, even if it means working in or using their own resources and that. So if you're a company, try reach out to the community and you'll be more than likely get some help.
That's perfect. That's perfect. Thank you. And thank you for the shout out. And like I was in the Mutual Admiration Society, we're big fans of OWASP, and we love the fact that there is a consistent benchmark that we can actually compare these things to. So we didn't get any questions. And so with that, I would just like to thank Sean again for joining us. And I'd like to thank you folks for giving us your time. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us. So thank you, everybody. Have yourself a great day.
Thank you.